What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. In this video, I'm going to show you how to properly time a 2-liter turbo chain-driven engine. The engine I have here on the stand is out of probably a 2010 Audi Q5. It is going to be very similar to the VW CCTA and CBFA engine codes. The main difference there is this one has Audi valve lift, and those engines are not going to have that. However, the timing process is going to be pretty much the same. We're going to go over how to time all the balance shafts and time the timing circuit of the engine. Now, I normally don't take this hard of a stance on what I'm about to say next, but this is very important. This video is not meant to replace the factory repair manual for doing this job. You still need to have the factory repair manual when you do this job. This is the type of job that you need to follow all the replacement bolt recommendations, all the factory torque specs, all of it. And of course, you want to make sure that if you're going this far in, you're replacing components, you're putting new guides on it, you're putting new chains on it. Now, this is a junk engine, so we're not going to be replacing any parts, but if you are doing this in your car, you want to make sure you get all new stuff on there. This is a very delicate operation, and anything that's not done 100% perfect can end up in, best case scenario, something minor wrong, like a little bit of engine vibration because we got our balance shafts out of time, to something catastrophic like timing chain failure and bending of valves. So it is very, very important, of the utmost importance, super critical, that you have the factory repair manual while doing this kind of work on an engine. If you don't have the factory repair manual, I will put a link down in the description where you can go and download what you need. It's not free, but that small investment for the repair manual is going to be worth every penny. So there's your warning, there's your disclaimer. Make sure that you are following everything step by step. And now let's strip this engine down and go ahead and retime it. All right, we have our engine completely stripped down of all of our chains. The only chain that's hanging out here is the oil pump chain, and it's not timed, but we're still gonna go ahead and put it on. Now, in order to be sure we can see all this a little bit easier, I'm gonna add some extra marking to everywhere where it makes sense to add some marking. These are just really accentuating the timing marks that are already on the engine. I'll pull this balance shaft gear off and go ahead and do that. We'll mark our cams, where our colored links are going to go, and we'll mark our balance shaft. We're going to also mark our crankshaft gear. You'll notice there's an arrow here pointing towards the teeth of the gear. There's an arrow here pointing towards these teeth, and then this outer gear set, this is for the oil pump drive, so we don't need to worry about this one. The only two marks we need to worry about are this one and this one here. This mark that's pointing to the outer teeth is for the balance shaft. That's the furthest back chain as we're looking at the front of the engine. This one here points to the middle gear set, which is our timing gear set. So we'll go ahead and just paint those, make them a little easier to see. Now we'll be able to see those at a little quicker glance. Now, if we flip the gear over, we'll notice that there is a tiny flat spot right there. This is sort of like a key, a very poor quality key for this crankshaft gear. This has to mate up with the spot down here on the crankshaft itself. You'll also notice that there's a notch right above where that flat spot is. I like to paint that too, and then we'll go ahead and paint it to the corresponding gear tooth, and then one more time on the outside. This will be our indicator telling us where that flat spot is, because as we install this gear, we're only going to be looking at it this way. We won't be able to see the backside of it. So that's just a little quick indicator. Speaking of that crankshaft gear, it's very important to make sure you do a good thorough inspection on this gear before just installing it. A lot of times when there's engine damage, that little keyway gets rounded out. And if that keyway is rounded off, like you can see here, then what typically happens is your gear to your crankshaft ends up out of time. And if that's the case, of course, then your engine is going to be out of time. Might still run, but odds are you're going to get some timing faults. So that's going to be something you need to pay extra close attention to. Do a thorough inspection on these parts before simply putting them back in. Now let's go ahead and talk about getting our engine primed up to get our chains put on. As you can see, we have our camshafts already installed and bolted down. These camshafts are pretty close in the spot that they're going to end up being in. I think this intake cam needs to roll back just a little bit, but we're close, and that's going to be good enough for what we're doing at first. Moving down, you can see we have our balance shaft chains pretty much in place. This is roughly where the exhaust side balance shaft is going to time up. For our front side balance shaft or our intake side balance shaft, we have the balance shaft, which is this gear back a little bit, and then we have the relay shaft. We need to make sure that these two gears are timed together. If these two gears aren't timed properly, your overall balance shaft circuit is going to be out of time, and you'll end up with some engine vibrations. Moving on to our crankshaft, which is this right here, what we're looking for this to be at TDC is that flat spot on the crankshaft that lines up with the flat spot on the gear should basically be at 12 o'clock. If we look at where the main bearing cap bolts to, we'll see the brake right here. These need to be parallel. What we can also do is look just above where we're looking at the crankshaft here, and you'll actually see the connecting rod for piston number 1 should be pretty much at TDC. If it's off a tiny bit, that's not a problem. But if you look through that little tiny window there, and that's not what you see, you need to get that cylinder 1 piston up to TDC. And we don't need to worry anything about our oil pump chain. That'll just go on when we put this gear on. Let's go ahead and start with our balance shaft chain, since it's, well, the one that we need to start with because it's the furthest one back. We have our exhaust balance shaft roughly in the place that it's going to be. This moves pretty easily, so if we need to adjust it a little bit, no big deal. The other side, on the intake, we need to get this timed up. Now, if you're just doing this as maintenance, do not take this gear off. You don't need to. I'm only taking it off to show you guys how to time this properly. If you look on this gear, this is the actual balance shaft, you'll see a little dot, and these actually are usually painted from the factory with a yellow mark. That is one of our timing marks we need to pay attention to. That mark usually ends up right at the 6 o'clock position. Now the other side, on the gear that I just pulled off, we have 2 little dots that we need to line up. You can see them right here. That tooth that had the 1 dot on the balance shaft itself lines up right in between these 2 teeth that each have a dot on them. Now these are only going to line up once every 8 turns, so if for some reason you spin the balance shaft, it's going to take a minute in order to line it back up. Those are our 2 teeth with the 2 dots. They're on the back set of gears. Let's go ahead and put that in. Make sure we line that up. There we go. So that should line up just like that. And then our mark that's going to line up with the chain is the dot on the outer part of the gear right here. Now our chain, like the timing chain, has darkened marks on them. You can see this one and this one are quite a bit darker than the other one. There's actually 3 darkened marks. This is the one that goes on the crankshaft gear. So we're going to take those 2 marks and line them up here and on our exhaust balance shaft gear. We're not going to worry about the crankshaft just yet. So we'll take the one, we get one side lined up. You can see it right there, nice and lined up. We'll go ahead and mark this so you guys can see it a little easier. We'll double check and make sure that these are still lined up properly. If you don't move this gear much, it shouldn't matter. We'll take our other side of our chain and we'll line the darkened mark up to that yellow mark that I painted on. Next, we are going to put our rail on for the top side of the balance shaft chain. Now we're going to leave this way for about 1.5 minutes because what we need to do next is we need to put our timing chain on. Now just like our balance shaft chain, our timing chain has some darkened links. This one has a copper link to it as well. This is actually an older version of the chain. There is an updated version of the chain. You want to make sure you're using the newest revision because we want to make sure that we use the best chain that's out there. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this chain, we're going to drop it down through where the cylinder head and the block are bolted together. We're going to drop it down, and all we're going to do is we're just going to hang it. We're going to hang it on the cams just like that, and we're just going to leave it there. Next, the important step of paying very close attention to what we're doing, we're going to put this crankshaft gear on. You're also going to want to make sure you have at the ready your bolt with the special tool, or if you have the newer one, which is way nicer than this, you want to get that ready too. So we have our mark here on the back. This is the mark that's going to be facing straight up. Here is our balance shaft mark. That's our timing mark, and we don't have to worry about the oil pump. So what we're going to do, some of these engines, you can put this gear on and you have enough room to loop the oil pump chain up and over the gear. Others you can't. Usually the way I find out is I forget to do it, and then, well, it doesn't reach, so I have to end up taking it back off. So what I've gotten in the habit of doing at this point is I will take this gear, I will put the oil pump chain on, I'll get the gear roughly where it's going to go, right about there. I'll put the timing chain through, doesn't matter where, then I'll go ahead and put it on the engine. You need to make sure that it goes on there all the way. If you're not sure if it's on all the way, take it back off and try it again. Now what we should find is that our balance shaft should pretty much line up. You can see our mark right there. Lines up pretty well. All of our other marks are still in their place. Now, before you do anything else, take your bolt with your big spacer on it and install it. If we don't do that, we run the risk of the gear moving off of the crankshaft, and then we're gonna end up with our crankshaft to our gear being mistimed. If you'd like, if you're a fan of marking, which I know a lot of you guys are, you can take another mark and just boop right there so that we see the mark that we made lining up TDC of the crank to the gear is now lined up to the block. That'll just be another quick little visual indicator that, hey, we got it on there the right way. Next, let's go ahead and put the rest of our balance shaft chain guides on. We'll get this one down here. We'll go ahead and put our tensioner on as well. Another opportunity to just make sure that, hey, my marks line up. Whether you paint your own or not, doesn't matter. You should still have the marks lining up. Then we'll put our tensioner in. Make sure, I usually take my finger and I'll just hold tension on the chain. Make sure all my marks line up. Things get a little sideways on you. Remember, you always want the slack of the chain before it's tensioned on the tensioner side. That way the tensioner does what it's supposed to do and takes up the slack. Next up, it is time to get our camshafts timed up and deal with our timing chain. This is probably one of the most critical things we're gonna do. A mistake here can actually lead to engine damage. What we're gonna first do is we're gonna first set our camshafts. And in order to do that, we need our camshaft holding special tools right here. What these are gonna do is these are gonna bolt on right here in the front of the cylinder head and then slide so we can lock our camshafts. We have one for the intake camshaft and one for the exhaust camshaft. You're also going to need a 15mm wrench for the exhaust camshaft. This is going to allow us to turn the camshaft just a little bit, and you'll need an 18mm wrench for the intake side. This again will allow us just to move the camshaft a little bit to get it locked into place. We want to try and lock them into place as close as we can to their TDC position. Now, there's no factory markings for the cam gear to the cylinder head or the cam bridge or anything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a measurement from this guide rail mount to our marks on our gears themselves. So the distance from this center portion of our guide holder to our mark on our intake side is going to be 61 to 64 millimeters. We'll go ahead and take that measurement. So that's 61. It looks like 61. We're off about 2 teeth. What we're going to do to lock our camshaft down is we'll take our 18mm wrench, we'll rotate the camshaft until our mark lines up with our caliper. That's going to be right about there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to slide the cam lock in. And that might mean we have to roll it back a little. That might mean we have to roll it forward a little. One way or another, we're going to lock that in place. Now we'll take our measurement again, and we're right at about 62 millimeters. So that should be exactly where we need this to be. And now our camshaft's locked in so it won't jump out of place. We're going to do the same thing for the exhaust side. Now they don't give a measurement from here to here on the exhaust side, but they do give you a total measurement between the two cam gear marks. That total measurement is 124 to 126 millimeters. Which basically means that this distance is going to be about the same as this distance. So we should be in the 62 or so millimeter range from the center part of the upper guide holder to the mark on our exhaust cam. We're actually pretty darn close. Let's take our overall measurement, and that's 125 millimeters, which is exactly where we want to be. So what we'll do is we'll just slide and lock our exhaust cam in. That went right on, no problem. Now that we have our cams locked, we can go ahead and put our timing chain on. We'll just line up our marks here. Now, if you're worried about the exhaust side chain popping off, you can zip tie through here and that'll hold it on a little bit better. There's not a ton we can do on this side. I guess we could get a clamp or something and clamp it on. Really though, you don't really need to do anything here. We can just leave these as is. Now we need to move down to the bottom side and get our timing chain lined up on our crankshaft gear. You'll notice that it actually dropped right into time. We have another darkened mark and then our paint mark for our timing gear right here on the crankshaft gear. Let's go ahead and throw another little mark just to make it easier to see on the bottom of our timing chain. There we go. If you want to take an extra cautious step and hold this timing chain in place, what you can do is run a zip tie through it. Use the zip tie to hold a little bit of tension on the chain. This is not a necessary step, just one of those little extra things that gives you a bit of peace of mind. Now we can start putting some of our guides on our timing chain. We'll start with the one up at the top. That one just pops right on. We'll then take our intake side guide, slide that up and into place. We can go ahead and get rid of our zip tie holding the chain on. We'll need a little bit of slack in the chain for the next guide. For the tensioner side guide, we actually need to take off the lock for the exhaust cam. What we'll do is we'll take our 15mm wrench back behind the gear. We'll pull tension off the lock, slide it out, and then the gear's gonna roll back just a little bit, but we have our guide on, and our intake cam is locked, so it shouldn't jump time or anything like that. Again, if you're worried about it, throw a zip tie through the hole and zip tie the chain down. Now we have a lot of slack here in our tensioner side of our timing chain. We can take our guide, slide it up and into place. Now we have this guide on. We can actually throw our tensioner on. Next step, let's take our lock off of our intake side. We'll do the same thing we did with the exhaust side. Just pull the tension off of the lock so you can slide it out. Let the cam go slowly. We're good there. Now, before you do anything else, double check all your marks. Make sure everybody lines up happily. Go ahead, pull your tensioner pin. Our next step is going to be to double check our work. That means we're going to rotate the engine around 2 full revolutions and make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. Now, here's the kicker. These links that we painted, when we rotate this engine around 2 times, they're not going to line back up with these camshafts or with the crankshaft or really any other link to gear mark. None of that stuff is going to line up. It takes way more revolutions for all that stuff to line back up perfectly than just the 2 rotations that we are going to do. So you have a couple of options. We already have that added TDC mark down here on the crankshaft, so we don't really need to worry about that. If you want to rotate it around by hand twice and take that measurement and the distance between the 2 timing marks on the gears, I'm all for that. Another option is to put your own marks as reference points on a fixed location. So we would take and paint right here and maybe right here on the cylinder head cover. You could also do that down in here. Whatever you need to do really to make sure that when you rotate this around 2 times, everybody lines up happily. So now we're just going to use these as reference marks for when we rotate around. Also, if you're using this plastic washer, be sure you don't have any spark plugs or anything like that. When we rotate this engine around, we don't want to have any extra tension on this nylon washer piece here. It's up to you if you want to put the oil pump guide on now or wait. I like to wait. That way it's one less thing to take off if I have to retime it. If we rotate the crankshaft around 2 full revolutions, it's going to be 1 rotation of the camshafts. So you need to do the crankshaft an even number of rotations. Okay, so that's 2 revolutions. You can see our mark lines up here. Let's check our marks up at the top. Yep. Notice though, look at, these are 2 painted marks that we didn't even use, and nowhere on our marks on our gear to our marks on our chain lines up at all. That's why you can't rely on the marks that you mark from the chain to the gear in any way to line back up on our 2 rotations. What we can do though, is we can make sure our marks that we added line up. That's why, one of the reasons why I like to add them just as a quick visual reference. I mean, if we do it right and follow the repair manual, we shouldn't need to do that. I just like the quick, hey, look, here's a mark, cool, it lines up, and move on. Once you've rotated around 2 times and made sure your timing is right, if everybody lines up happy, you're good to go. You can take this top measurement one more time just to make sure that it's lined up and good. Double check all your marks. Otherwise, it's time to put your oil pump tensioner on, put your timing cover on, and complete the rest of your timing job. All right, so we are properly timed. Everything's happy. All of our marks line up. Make sure you're rotating this around at least twice on the crankshaft, maybe more if you want to. That's cool too, to be sure that everybody's back up at TDC where it belongs. That includes cylinder number 1 piston. That way we can make sure our crankshaft gear to our crankshaft is properly timed. And of course, with all the rest of the steps, make sure you're following the factory repair manual. I like to put a new lower cover on. Make sure you replace this crankshaft bolt. Be careful putting the pulley on. That can get a little weird too. And of course, if you have questions or comments, drop them down below. I'll drop links to everything that we used today down in the description. Guys, with that, I'm out. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck timing. Make sure you have the factory repair manual, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.